Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are chapter links in the video timeline. So this week I have a few tidbits. I have some updates on some of my sweater history research that I've been working on the past few weeks, and I have some project updates. Things that I am working on or will be working on very soon. So let's get started. So I have a few tidbits this week, most of which has to do with 19th century knitting. The first one is a picture of a women's hockey team in the 1890s. And what's interesting about it is that the sweaters, the team sweaters that they're wearing. I showed you a couple of weeks ago pictures from the Delineator, a women's monthly magazine that was published by Butterick. I showed you pictures from an article that they had on the rules of basketball. And they explained the rules in there, and they had different photographs of the girls in different positions, and that you could tell they were on different teams because one had I think, plain white sweater and the other one had a striped sweater. So what's interesting about those sweaters back then is that they were always turtlenecks with these athletic jerseys, because that's what sweaters were, is athletic jerseys. And they tended to be very long, and oftentimes they flipped the hems up. So this is a photograph. I got the link from Engineering Knits. She does historical knitting and some sewing on her channel. And she had sent me this link to this picture of this girls or women's, I think it was a college women's hockey team in the 1890s, which I thought was pretty cool. One of the things I am constantly looking for are more knitting manuals from the 19th century. I'm particularly interested at this point in American or US publications, because I can find an awful lot of them that were published in the UK, and I have questions a lot of times about whether some of these items that were really popular to knit in the British books, if that was something that American women would have worn also. I can't always tell, and in part I can't tell maybe because labels might have been different for things. I told you guys about the polka jacket that was a big popular type of outdoor wear garment for women in England back in like the 1840s and 50s. So there was a knitted version, and there were also versions that were made from really fine woven cloth and ermine fur. Somebody told me last week or the week before, it's not pronounced ermine, even though that's how it's spelled. It's pronounced ermine, so it rhymes with vermin, I guess. So there were really fine versions of these expensive versions, and then there were knitted versions. And I was trying to figure out, were they knitting those here, or was it just something that was done in the UK? And so I've really been struggling to find mid-century knitting manuals that were published here in the US. I thought I found one, and it was a facsimile reproduction that had been published just a few years ago, but it was now out of print, really expensive to get even used, and the Textile Center here in town had it in their library. So I've talked about this before. All of our local guilds, so the Weavers Guild, the Knitters Guild, Crochet Guild, Machine Knitters Guild, Embroidery, all of those different guilds, in addition to the Textile Center themselves, all have their books at this library in the Textile Center. And as long as you are a member of one of those guilds or of the Textile Center itself, you can check out any of their books. So I looked, and they had this book. I was so excited, and I got it. It was listed as a book that they use in these historic reenactment, living history museums here in the United States and Massachusetts. And they look at this book that was published in 1858 or 1838, and they really use it as a way of understanding what people would be making at home, and they use them in their demonstrations. So I got the book, and I'm reading through it. And I realized I had actually seen this book before online, and it was printed in England. So I'm still not sure what they were doing here. So as I've been looking for all of these things, I came across a website that lists all of these different places to find 19th century knitting patterns online. So I'm going to leave that down below. So I use archive.org a lot, but there are other places where you can find knitting patterns from the 19th century. And so that's a fantastic resource, and I'll leave that below. Two more websites that I have found in the past couple of days, which I think are going to be incredibly useful, is one of them I just found this morning. It's somebody who collects knitting gauges, like for sticking your needles in to see what size needle it is. They collect North American knitting gauges. And a problem that we have from the US patterns is that we did not standardize needle sizes until after World War II. The UK had needle gauges pretty early on. Some of those first early women who were creating knitting books, like Jane Gauguin and Miss Lambert and those people, they came out with these knitting gauges. And so if you were reading one of their patterns, you could use the needle that you had to check against her knitting gauge to understand if you were using the needle sizes that she was talking about. So they had these brass, really nice knitting gauges there in the UK, and we didn't have them here. They started importing some apparently from Germany. So this person who put together this webpage has this collection, and so you can see different knitting companies what needle sizes they were using. So one of the reasons this is really interesting to me is that I bought this book earlier this year. It's Fleischer's Knitting and Crocheting Manual. It was published in 1913. And I was flipping through it, and most of this, like probably the first 3/4 of this book is crocheting, and then you get to the knitting at the end. What they have in here is this page. They have a picture of all of their knitting needles, and what they say is that some women have told us that they have trouble in obtaining the sizes of hooks and needles as specified in the directions. This is due to the unfortunate lack of a standard measure among manufacturers of these goods. The system used in Fleischer's Knitting and Crocheting Manual is the metric system, and the numbers represent the actual diameter of the hooks and needles in millimeters. You will find that the better grade goods are numbered in this way. I was kind of surprised by that because the UK wasn't using the metric system for their needles yet. Of course, their patterns are missing a lot of other important information like gauge and size information, things like that. But at least you know the needle size, what the needle size is that they're using. So I found that site that had the needle gauges, and some of these gauges would even include, like, they'd have all of these holes in them, and they would say, well, you know, on one side of the gauges say, well, this company uses the holes, they number them this way. And then on the back side, these companies number the holes in this other way. So you could kind of compare one brand to another and kind of figure out if you were using a certain brand of knitting needle, but you're using a pattern from a different company, maybe you could figure out the equivalent. But it is one of the most frustrating things about vintage patterns, particularly as you get into antique territory. So anything prior to World War II can be really problematic, especially in the American patterns, to figure out what the needle size is, because, as I said, they often don't give you the gauge. Sometimes they give you a gauge, but oftentimes they don't. And they don't always give you, they hardly ever give you finished size. Once in a while, they'll tell you, this is for a 36-inch bust, but you don't really know, well, how much ease are they building into that? Can't always tell. And on top of that, you don't know what kind of fabric they're trying to produce with a particular yarn. So even if you figured out the needle size and you think, oh, well, this needle size usually gives such and such a gauge, you don't really know what fabric is intended from that. This web page is, I think, really handy if you are using patterns that come from a certain company and they're talking about their needle size and you're not really sure what that equates to in today's needle sizes. That will at least give you some indication. You can kind of figure out, well, what the likely gauge is, at least for the pattern. You may not really understand the yarn totally, but you may get closer to what the gauge probably is. And the last tidbit is it's an article, I think it's from a blog post, but it's an article that was written by a woman, and I believe at least some form of this article originally appeared in Piecework magazine back in like 2009. And it's about mid-19th century knitting yarns, because this is something, as I've been reading through these manuals, I'm like, what is this yarn? Like a lot of times I'll talk about fleecy yarn, and I'm like, what is that yarn? And so this article talks a lot about the various yarns that are typically called for in these patterns, and then she talks about what the modern equivalents might be. And I found that really useful to be able to use, because a lot of the online charts, like conversion charts or charts that talk about vintage yarns, are really focused on a particular time frame. So they might be focused on the 1930s and 40s or even into the 50s, but they're not focused on earlier time periods. Nowadays, if we get a pattern and it calls for a yarn that we don't know what it is, we can either look on Ravelry and see, well, what yarn weight is it at least, or what gauge is it normally it's supposed to be knit at, or find something out about those yarn qualities. Or we can use a website that's called yarnsub.com, which allows you to type in that exact yarn. And that site usually tells you more information than Ravelry sometimes does about how the yarn is constructed. Like if is it woolen spun versus worsted spun? How many plies does it have? Tell you how many yards per 100 grams or things like that. And then how many yards you are getting in a particular ball, because the ball might be 50 grams, it might be 100 grams, it might be 4 ounces, something like that. And then it'll give you a list of yarns that would make good substitutes, and they'll tell you sort of the percentage match for that yarn. So if something's 100% match, it's exactly the same kind of yarn, same fiber content, same number of plies, same construction of the yarn itself, same number of yards per 100 grams, same amount of twists, all that kind of things. And you're going to get a really excellent substitution. And then they go down in reverse order, so that you start finding things that will be less good, less good, less good. And sometimes it'll be, the percentage may not be as good a match, but it could still be a good match. It might be acrylic rather than wool, and maybe you're looking for acrylic rather than wool. So that's another good website. But this particular webpage I was talking about mid-century, mid-19th century yarns, is really handy to have, because some of the websites don't really tell much about it, or they give conflicting information. And I feel like she really seems to know her stuff more than maybe some of these other websites who don't cite any sources or don't go into any further detail that would give you any clue that they actually know what they're talking about. So a couple of weeks ago, I finished up my 1920s sweater, and after I mentioned that I wasn't going to be wearing it, people had offered suggestions for what I could do to modify it to make it more wearable, and I realized that I hadn't told my people watching my channel that the sweater was part of a larger project that I'm working on, which is to knit my way through the 20th century, decade by decade, one sweater at a time. And what I've decided to do is go back one more decade to the 1890s and knit a sweater from that time period. So a lot of people have been encouraging me to write a book about this journey, about the different sweaters and what I've learned from each of them. So I am doing a lot of research. Whether or not this will actually become a book or not, or whether it becomes a book that ever gets published, I don't know. But I am doing a lot of research, and some of the research that I had been interested in was really uncovering more about the history of what we call the sweater, and sort of defining what a sweater actually is. And I knew from the standpoint of this long-term project that the sweater was a sort of the product of the late 19th century because it was an athletic garment. So these 1890s patterns and into the early 20th century tend to be garments that were worn when people were doing athletic activities. For men, it could be football or baseball. For men and women, it could be golf, tennis, cycling, yachting, all kinds of activities. But outdoor activities where they are exerting some energy and probably sweating. So their sweaters were things that you wore when you were sweating. But I knew that they were traditional sweaters, knitted sweaters that came before that were kind of pockets. They were certain types of sweater that certain pockets of people wore, like the fisherman gansey that was worn in the kind of the North Sea and around the coast of Scotland. And I wasn't really clear on when those originated, and there was conflicting information, and I wasn't really sure about some of the Scandinavian regions when their sweaters were created, because there's often this idea that, well, sweaters were originally knit in the round seamlessly, and I haven't been so convinced of that. I think that was probably true for some types of sweaters like the Gansey, but perhaps not for others, because these traditional Danish sweaters that I was looking into last fall, which really do date back to like the 1600s, 1700s, they were worn as one of these layers that Danish women had in their clothing. And all that was actually seen was like part of a sleeve, but they had an upper body, and they were pretty elaborately knitted in knit purl patterns, often with that 8-pointed star that you see in Norwegian sweaters done in stranded color work, but these were just in texture. And so those really do date back a long time, and yet those were not knit completely in the round and seamlessly. They, in parts, were knit flat. Parts of them were knit in the round, and the sleeves were knit first and separately and then sewn in. So there seemed to me like there was probably a variety of construction techniques. And so I was starting to kind of look into that. A woman named Teresa left me a link in the comments of last week's video, and she had heard about a master's thesis that a woman named Gail Ann Lambert had done back in 2002. And the title of it is The Taxonomy of Sweater Structures and Their Origins. And so she sent me the link to it, and I got it. I was so excited. And she said, maybe it will coincide with what you're learning about the history of sweaters. I started reading it, and at the first few pages was like a recitation of everything I had researched and concluded. And I was like, I started getting kind of a sick feeling in my stomach, because I thought, I was excited that somebody had done this. And then I was feeling sick that somebody had done this. And what's the point of me doing it all if somebody else has already done it? So I kept reading, and what I discovered was it gave me all of the information that I wanted to know about the history of the sweater, but there was no overlap in terms of what it is I'm doing in my project, the actual project that I'm doing, which is the knitting of these sweaters and figuring out how techniques evolved and were used differently over the course of the 20th century to bring us where we are today. Because that's really what the purpose of my project is, to kind of look at how techniques and construction methods evolved. So there isn't an overlap in that way. And so actually it's great. And so the first half of it is, text and writing and all about her research and what she did and footnotes and all that. And then the end of it is a lot of charts and drawings. So she charted out each type of sweater shape from each region, each of these traditional sweaters. And from each region, and she talked about sort of when they originated, how they were constructed. So were they knit flat in the round? Were they seamed? Did they have underarm gussets? Was there a yoke? Was it, how was it constructed? And so all of that is laid out, and it's really great to see. And what you see is that there was a variety of things. So the majority of these sweaters originated in the 19th century and into the 20th century. So there are only a few examples of traditional sweaters that began earlier than the 19th century, which I think is really interesting because those traditional sweaters are very simple in shape. And yet this was all going on at the same time that we're seeing other types of upper body garments being developed and put in written patterns. And those do tend to use more dressmakers techniques. They do more often tend to be knit flat and seamed, but that often has to do with the fact that they use a lot of shaping, and they're constructed in ways that allow things to be very closely fit but also very fashionable. And it's just a different type of garment than the sort of basically shapeless 3 tubes that you've seen a lot of traditional sweaters. If you're interested, I will leave that link down below, and I thank you, Teresa, for giving me the heads up on that. I'm really delighted with that. I'm knitting another pair of socks right now. They're just a pair of socks. I am done with one sock and just past the heel on the second one. These are for my daughter's boyfriend. It's funny. Every so often I go online and I buy self-striping yarn. I just feel like, oh, I want to knit some socks. I'm looking at my yarn right now. And I don't see anything that I really like, and so we'll go on a website or something like that, and I'll look at what they have for self-striping yarn, and I'll buy a bunch of it, like 5 or 6 different balls, whatever I can find that I really like, and I'll restock my self-striping yarn. So apparently I liked this colorway so much that I bought it 2 different times. And even though I bought it twice, I don't get a pair of socks I made the first pair last year during the August sock knit along. Oh, and I was knitting along with everyone else. I had a friend who had her husband threw her a surprise 70th birthday party, and so I thought, oh, I'll make her a pair of socks. And I had her measurements already because I'd made her socks once before, which is the really nice thing, is if you just keep a notebook of your friends and family, anybody that you find knitworthy and you think you would knit something for them sometime, take all these different measurements and just keep them in a file folder or a notebook or something like that, and a spreadsheet, whatever. And that way, sometime in the future, when you want to knit them a surprise present, you can do that without them having any idea that you're up to something. So last year I knit my friend Becky a pair of socks using this colorway. And so this year I'm knitting Sam a pair. And it's actually, I think it's going to work out okay with a single ball of yarn that I have to make them completely match. I was a little worried that the second sock I might not either have enough yarn or that I wouldn't have enough yarn to keep the color sequence matching. But since I had Becky's leftovers, I thought, oh, I have extra yarn just in case it doesn't work out. But I think I'm going to have enough of that ball of yarn to get through exactly and have everything match. So one of the reasons I originally hadn't thought I would want to knit something from the 1890s is because I thought that the sweater constructions would be more simple and less diverse than what I could find in the 1900s, because there were a couple of basic ways that sweaters were constructed. The construction process for women's sweaters in the early 1900s, because it was the Edwardian era and you had the big blousing thing, that was really elaborate, but it was consistently done the same way over and over and over again. They just were swapping out stitch patterns. So I didn't think they were going to be all of that interesting in the 1890s. And the only sweater that I had found for women in the 1890s had these big balloon sleeves that looked kind of cool, but I just wasn't interested in knitting. So the books I've been looking through were both published by Butterick. One was published in 1892. It's called The Art of Knitting. And the second one, it was published in 1897, and it's called something like, I'll put it on the screen. I think it's something like Fancy and Practical Knitting, something like that. It's considered the more advanced knitting book compared to The Art of Knitting. And a lot of these patterns came from their monthly magazine, The Delineator. So those, I'm looking at those 2 books, and then I looked through the issues of The Delineator in the 1890s, and there was also a man's sweater pattern published in either 1898 or 1899. I think it was May 1898 for a sweater. So I looked at those It's a small number of sweaters, but it was interesting because every one of them has a different method of construction, and that really surprised me. They have some similarities, like in most cases they were knit with knit one, purl one ribbing. The 1898 one has a different stitch pattern. The one I chose was a boy's sweater, and I explained it last week, and a couple of people said, oh, that reminds me of Barbara Walker's Knitting from the Top construction, or that reminds me of Elizabeth Zimmerman's Naglar, which is raglan spelled backwards, her Naglar construction. Those are interesting and different, unique constructions, but they're not what this one is. And so I'll put a little picture so you maybe can kind of see. So the body is worked in the round up to the armpits. And then you separate the front from the back and you knit. In this pattern, which was for a boy, was to knit the fronts and the back each for 7 inches. And then you rejoin in the round at the top of the shoulder. And you work and you're decreasing along the shoulder line right here. Every like 3 rounds or something, you're decreasing 4 stitches per round, and until it just keeps coming up to the top of the neck, and then you switch to stripes for the turtleneck to flip over. And it's a weird construction. I have such a hard time imagining that it's going to work. I'm interested to see how it does work. There's no underarm bind offs, and so that is going to change how the 7 inches that gets knit flat, how that's going to fit on the body. And I spent all last weekend trying to understand what the original proportions of that sweater were, like what the actual measurements were, so that I could then grade it up to something that would fit me. And I was struggling because some of what it's doing, I can't look this up anywhere else. It's the only sweater I've ever seen that has this construction. And I finally kind of figured out what the yarn was that was going to be used. It's one of these 19th century yarns that I wasn't quite sure what the yarn weight was. The sweater was supposed to fit a boy age 10 to 12. And I'm like, how big was a boy age 10 to 12 back in 1892 or 1895? I didn't know. And then even if I found that out, how much bigger than the boy would the sweater be? These are all things I couldn't quite figure out. So I finally found, it was like a book for people learning to cut garments, to learn how to tailor. And it was a book about, how to do that for boys, young men, and men. And there was a chart in there that showed the average size of a 10-year-old and one of a 12-year-old. And so then I could say, okay, it would be about this big. So I kind of figured out what the size of the sweater actually was. But I was still struggling with how to size that up, using that yarn and then sizing it up. And what I finally realized was I could actually use a thicker yarn. I was calling for a yarn that's probably like a fingering sport weight yarn. And I realized if I used a worsted weight yarn, I could use the exact same stitch counts for the entire thing. And then I can see understand how it's proportioned, so that I don't have to try to not only figure this out, but also try to grade it. I think this is going to be a lot easier. So I ordered the yarn that I'm going to use. The original colors in the black, it's black and white photo, but the original colors were, I think they called it either cardinal or scarlet and white. So, and I love red. So I ordered some mostly red and then some white yarn. And I'm going to make myself this sweater in worsted weight yarn. And because the sweaters for the adult men use a yarn that would be worsted weight. So this was, a little boy, and so it was scaled down with thinner yarn. And so I feel okay about doing that. A lot of times with these vintage and antique patterns, I really want to understand the yarn that was originally used so I can better understand what the fabric quality was like, or even what the yarn quality was like, because you can't always tell, even if it's fingering weight, what the qualities of that yarn were that caused them to decide to use that for this garment. And so really trying to understand what these garments were really like, not just, I can knit something that comes out to the right size. that is easy enough to do. The hard part is really understanding what those yarns and what those fabrics were actually like. I was telling you guys last week about an event that went on. It was a virtual event online called Co-COVID. It's either Co-COVID or Co-COVID. It's a group of YouTubers that do costuming. Some of them do cosplay, some do reenactments, some of them maybe work in making costumes for professionally for plays or whatever. So it's the costuming community on YouTube. They put together this virtual conference as a replacement for Costume College, which is an in-person conference that normally would occur on that same weekend. It had to get canceled. They had a whole schedule of events, and so I watched quite a few of the live stream events, and then I picked and chose from some of the other ones that were just premiering at a certain time on a certain day, because it's all mostly sewing, and so that's not quite as much what I'm interested in, but there were some things that I was interested in. Well, last night I was watching one that had been live streamed on the weekend, and it was about size inclusion in costuming. Because a lot of people feel like, oh, everybody back then was teeny tiny and had an 18-inch waist, and I feel weird because I'm like a normal 21st century size person, and I never see clothing like that in museums when they have old dresses, and I don't see any of that kind of stuff in vintage stores. Like when you go shopping at vintage stores, everything's super, super tiny. And so that was what this live stream was about, was sort of dispelling those myths. And it was fascinating. Even if you don't sew, you don't want to make costumes, it's really fascinating just from the historical standpoint of it, and understanding why it is you see what you see in museums and why it is you see what you find in vintage stores. So for one thing, textiles are very fragile and they don't last. If you wear them over and over again, they don't last. They fall apart. The other thing, so the things that survive that you see in museums often are things that were worn for a very special occasion, like once or twice. And if they were very tiny, they were probably for somebody who was just a tiny person or a teenager. And the reason that it survives is because it couldn't get remade into something for somebody else. So the clothing that was started out larger gets remade into things that get smaller and smaller, get reconstructed and made into other things. And so they get worn and worn and worn and worn until they fall apart. So that's part of it. The second thing is, if you're looking for vintage clothing from like the 1940s or something, which is really popular right now, that's 80 years ago. In the 1960s, you probably could have found it, and you could have found it in a wide range of sizes. People have bought those. So the only thing left are the tiny ones that don't fit anybody. And they gave the analogy of like when you go to a shoe store, the only shoes that are left are like the size 6 and the size 13 or something. That everything in between, which is what the majority of the people fit into, those are what go right away. So that was really interesting. They also talked about, there was a museum that got 2 versions of the same dress, like a Chanel dress in 2 different sizes. There was an exhibition and they wanted to put that on one of the dresses on exhibition, and they chose the smaller one. And the reason might have been in order to meet visitors' expectations about what they would see, or it could have been because that one was the one that was in better shape. So you don't know. So it was a really interesting live stream, and they were using the woman's version of that Tailor's Cutting Out Garments book that I had found for boys, where I'd found the chart that said how big a 10-year-old boy was and how big a 12-year-old boy was. They had charts for women, and they didn't say, the average woman has this particular dimensions. Like today, they'll say, oh, the average American woman wears a size 14 or 16 or whatever. They didn't do that. What they had were these charts that showed a whole range of bust measurements, like from 30 to 45 or 48 or something like that. And And then sort of the standard proportion for somebody with that size, but it wasn't like, it was the average proportions of somebody who had that bust measurement. It wasn't that the average person was this one size. And that clothing was proportioned in a certain way for everyone. So what didn't matter what size you were, it was proportioned so everybody wore the same kinds of fashions. They didn't have, oh, you have to shop in that store or that department. Everybody wore the same type of thing. So, and they also talked about how things got padded out. So like you bought your corset based on your waist size, but your bodice was made based on your bust size. So you had this corset, and if you didn't fill it out, then you padded in, or they had hip padding, you know, they had things that were padded all over the place. So these women have garments that they've purchased, you know, that are these vintage garments, and they look on the inside and they see how they've been altered, because they have inevitably have been altered to fit somebody else, like remade over time. Sometimes gussets were added in, or sometimes, you know, they had different things that were inventive for how they could add more room in different places for people over time if they needed to alter the garments. It's really, really fascinating. What was really interesting in there was they had a chart, and they were comparing what the ideal woman measurements, and they used two examples. One was a Lily Langtry, who is an actress and, you know, a mistress of the Prince of Wales and who knows else in the UK at the end of the 19th century. But they had her measurements. And then they had the measurements of like some Greek statue from classical antiquities, and they were comparing the classical figure with Lily Langtry. And what was interesting about Lily Langtry was that she had some hips on her, and that made me wonder how they were measuring women. Were they measuring them with their corsets on, and then with any sort of padding and petticoats that they would have on, so that the skirt could then be tailored? Like, what were they measuring, and how were they measuring? They don't say. And I assume that's because everybody would know how they would measure themselves back then. But Lily Langtry had like, I don't know, like a 36-inch bust and maybe a 27-inch waist, and then like 45-inch hips. And that was like the ideal woman. I was like, wow, that was really quite different. So I was looking at these sweater patterns from this book that was printed in 1913, where they didn't say to fit size bust this, they didn't say what the finished measurements were, but they did say the gauge for a couple of the patterns. And so I charted them all out, and I calculated how big they were. And these were sweaters that were meant to fit over, so that you'd have a corset, you'd have your blouse, you'd have your skirt, you know, you'd have all these other clothes on, and then you could put this sweater on over the top of it, and it would have to have a little room, but it did have some waist shaping to it. And I'll put a picture of some of them ones up here. So the bottom, these are long sweaters, they're like 28, 30 inches in length. And so they're going around the fullest part of the hips. And the circumference of those sweaters were like 51 inches around the hips. And then around the bust, they were like 44, I think. And then the waist was maybe 42 or something like that, 41. The waist was a little bit smaller than the bust, but certainly much smaller than the hips were. And I thought that is really interesting. And it really does make me wonder how much all of those layers of clothes added to the outside measurement, and then how much additional room that they wanted. But it also tells me that if you were a modern woman and you want to make one of those sweaters, because these 1913 sweaters, they're sort of exactly what I like in Minnesota. But I'm looking at them, I'm like, I would need to actually bring them down in size, because that would be too big, because I don't have all of those extra layers of clothing before I'd put the sweater on. I'd have, you know, a pair of jeans or something. It's fascinating, and to try to figure out what some of that sizing is like. Of course, it all changes in like the 1930s when you start getting everything form-fitting. But certainly the early part of the 20th century, a lot of those sweaters, I think, are pretty wearable today, and especially if you are a size. The thing is, they're wanting some of these to be knit on fingering weight yarn, and it's a lot of knitting to be 30 inches of sweater that's 50 inches in circumference. That's a lot of knitting for a long time, but they're beautiful sweaters. So, but it is something that, because they give you gauge, you could potentially scale it differently once you understood how they were built, and you could, potentially change yarn, change gauge as long as you knew what the actual size of the pieces were supposed to be, or what you wanted them to be. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.